Hello there, I'm Nick, and this is the Game Apologist, where we look for the good in bad games. But if you've been following along with this coverage of classic Sonic titles, so far we've had no real trouble finding the good in, well, great games. And we still have a little ways to go before... For now, let's focus on what may be the first actual divisive game in the mainline Sonic series, Sonic CD. Released on the Sega CD, an add-on for the Sega Genesis that really deserves its own episode, Sonic CD is often the first title you'll hear when asking for recommendations for this weird quasi-system. But if that's the case, what makes it so divisive? Well, a few things, but in this debate it's mostly among Sonic fans, and really it's generally over where this game stands in rankings when compared to other classic Sonic titles. As it is by itself, it's a really good game, so we'll be tackling this with the bias of a Sonic fan. A real challenge for me, let me tell you. So if you're on the outside looking in, I'll do my best to give you an understanding of why fans debate this title even today. I recommend checking out my videos covering Sonic 1 and 2 if you haven't yet, because I'm going to be referencing those games a lot this time around. The divisive nature of this game really reinforces the theme of duality found within the game and the real-world production of the title. Right at the beginning of this game, way back even in the conception stage, this game was set on a divergent path. It's like a parallel universe Sonic 2. That's because the developers behind the original Sonic game were split in two, then formed their own separate groups and went on to develop two Sonic sequels at the same time. Yuji Naka and Sega Technical Institute would work on Sonic 2 in America, while Naoto Oishima got his own team and went to work on CD in Japan. This also, strangely enough, kind of parallels the dual sequel development of Sonic's rival, Mario. And that duality continues within the game itself. Two versions of the future, two different endings, two different soundtracks, even two different Sonics. But we'll get into all that later as we pick apart this game. Anyway, we now have two different sequels to Sonic the Hedgehog, a game with very simple mechanics and a strong first outing, but one that could be improved upon. The two sequels would expand the original game and tackle its issues in wildly different ways. Like I said in my first video, a common gripe about Sonic 1 was that Green Hill was the best level of the game. A tropical jungle gym where the player could get used to Sonic's physics and momentum on a multi-layered map full of places to explore. The problem being that once that opening zone was completed, you were left with a more traditional linear platforming experience, or levels that never fully utilized Sonic's abilities. Sonic 2 solved this by practically remaking the first game. It streamlined a lot of its levels to keep the player moving as quickly as possible, removing a lot of the exploration and vertical nature of Green Hill Zone, and reworking a lot of the mechanics and themes that were introduced through the first game, giving them simplified but distinctive themes and layouts. This makes Sonic 2 much more accessible, and in turn, it feels like it's meant to replace the original game. You could play Sonic 2 without ever touching the first game and be perfectly fine. Sonic CD, on the other hand, feels like it went the complete opposite way in terms of design. And because of this, in some ways, it feels more like a true sequel than Sonic 2 does. If I had to sum it up in one statement, Sonic CD is made for Sonic gamers. Meaning you're probably going to have a much better time with this if you've had prior experience with the Hedgehog. Not for any narrative reasons. Classic Sonic has always been light on story. This one has Sonic trying to rescue a brand new character in a brand new location. Sonic's literally on a different planet in this game, so no real continuity to worry about. No, this game feels like if you were a fan of the first Sonic game and wanted more of that game, well, CD would be right up your alley. Sonic CD was released on the Sega CD after all, an add-on to the Sega Genesis. It wasn't likely that your very first experience with the Hedgehog would be with this title when Sonic 1 and 2 were already available on the base system. You'd be picking up this monstrosity to get even more Sonic, and that's exactly what this game is. A whole lot more Sonic. Or Sonic 1, anyway. Sonic CD doesn't mean to refine, but just add more of everything. It brought the design philosophy of Green Hill and applied it to every single level of this game, and then it just got excessive with it. And this is one of the major reasons why this game is so divisive to so many Sonic fans. All the visual details that made Green Hill pop are now everywhere through the entire game. But it also makes the game feel a little bit dated. The design is cluttered, chaotic, and incredibly 90s. Every level looks like it'd be right at home on the cover of a Trapper Keeper. Like so many things from the early 90s, a lot of these designs are throwing too many ideas together. Barely cohesive, messy experiments with no focal point for your eye to follow. The colors are vibrant, the backgrounds are incredibly detailed, but it's all over-designed and messy. And I feel like this is in direct contrast with Sonic's design. I went into this in great detail in my first Sonic video, so I'll try to keep it short, but a point I made about the characters looked at, even if there were obvious 90s ideas at play, they kept it simple enough to make it iconic and timeless. These levels, on the other hand, are so loud that they could glitch out and you probably wouldn't even notice a difference. And it's not just in the aesthetics that feel over-designed, but the level layouts as well. I've said it plenty, Green Hill in Sonic 1 is a jungle gym. It's less about running to the end really quickly, at first at least, and more about using your speed to play around and explore the many gimmicks. But once you learned how Sonic played and how this world works, then you could very easily zip through the zone in a matter of seconds. The rest of Sonic 1 feels underdeveloped in comparison to the first zone, and Sonic CD solves this by turning every level into Green Hill Zone. Not in theme, at least not after Palm Tree Panic, but just in the sense that they are jam-packed with things to do. There is a massive emphasis on exploration through this entire game. All these levels feel like two-dimensional mountains. For a game that requires you to move horizontally to complete levels, it's incredibly vertical in design, and they become full-on labyrinths in later stages. Unlike Sonic 2, this game wants you to backtrack. It wants you to eat up as much of the allotted 10 minutes as possible. And that's where it kind of loses the whole point of Green Hill. Unless you're very committed to speedrunning this thing and dedicate some time and talent, you're going to find it somewhat difficult to zip through any of CD's levels. But it's not without purpose. Exploration is now an important part of the new gameplay gimmick: time travel. There are actually 4 versions of every zone built into this game: past, present, good future, and bad future. To get the good future, you are required to do some exploring. They didn't put in all this effort just so you could rush your spiny butt through this entire game without appreciating all of their hard work. Actually, finding a nice clear space to speed up is a challenge within itself, as speed is required to move you through time. Once you hit a past or future signpost, you need speed to activate the mechanic. Once you hit the necessary velocity, bright sparks will flash behind Sonic, and it's important to keep him going while the sparks are going off. As you'll notice, the little time icon will begin to flicker. If you come to a stop during this crucial period, the sign will vanish, and with it, your portal into the past or future, meaning you've got to do some more exploring to find another sign, find another clear path to stay at top speed, and then get into the past so you can make out with Sonic's mom. Should I keep referencing Back to the Future? I mean, I got this in Doctor Who. That's the only time travel references I know to make here. You're actually running through time to find robot generators. You take this sucker out in the past, and it destroys all remaining robots and makes a good future for that act, which are renamed zones in this game, even though that term had already been established, so I don't really know why they changed it. It's another needless complication. Speaking of weird changes, there is a weird little difference they made with the robots in this game. Normally in a Sonic game, you destroy these suckers and a little animal pops out. In this game, they swapped out the little animals with flowers. Not entirely important, but it's there. I don't know if it's just because these levels are larger in this game than the others, but it does feel like there are less enemies in this game compared to other classic Sonic games. And the flowers are actually an interesting way to keep track of how many baddies there are in each level. Since flowers can't scamper away like the animals do in the other games, these almost act like a trail of breadcrumbs to let you know where you've already explored, which can be really helpful when you're trying to track down a generator. And once you do destroy a generator, it destroys all the other robots in the level, and now the landscape will be sprinkled with fresh vegetation. But if you do miss your little animals, you can also track down a secondary machine which projects a hologram that, oh my god. We'll get more in depth with this woodland critter curb stomper a little later, but for now, all you need to know is you have to wreck these holograms like you would a generator, and you'll now have animals dancing around through the land. It doesn't really do anything, but if you want to feel like a Disney princess, you certainly have this option. While I don't mind this weird little change, I do kind of mind that they renamed the acts into zones. I know this point is incredibly nitpicky, but acts and zones were another little way that Sonic Team used to stand out from other platformers of the day. Instead of levels, these were zones, and that kind of put a weird ownership on this design. I know this is a small detail, but it feels like a needless complication. In fact, this game feels like it's full of needless complications, as you'll also see in Sonic's new moves. They have a spin dash like Sonic 2, but for whatever reason, it doesn't share that excellent revving animation. It's just a standard ball, and it's incredibly gimped to Sonic 2's version. You only get one set speed, you can't rev it up to make it go faster, and it's never as fast as Sonic 2's. They try to make up for this by adding the super peel out, which instead of pressing down an A, you now press up an A. And it's basically the same as a spin dash, you're just not in ball form. Now the animation looks awesome, and it does give you more speed than the spin dash, but it also lacks the protection provided by the spin dash. You can barrel through robots while you're rolled up, but the peel out leaves you vulnerable to take damage at high speeds. Now again, it's important to note that this wasn't made after Sonic 2. It was made at the same time and across the world during a time when the internet wasn't exactly a huge thing. Who knows how many notes were shared between the two separate developers? development teams. And maybe they were trying to do some risk-reward thing by having players choose between more speed or more defense. I don't really know. But the complexity doesn't stop there. A lot of the fans feel the new gimmick also makes progress somewhat tedious. The time traveling has led to some gripes I see fairly often among Sonic fans. Some just feel it's far too different from traditional Sonic gameplay, and since levels are designed around the mechanic, it leads to a less enjoyable experience if you're trying to play this like a normal Sonic game. That's just a complaint to these particular critics. There are other fans who love this mechanic, but even among these fans I see some consistent complaints pop up from time to time, namely with the future versions of each zone. Are you still with me? Alright, well hang on, it's about to get even more confusing, so try to keep up. Each level starts you off in the present, and you're required to go into the past if you want to destroy a robot generator to ensure the level has a good future. So you have reason to be in the past and present, but the game provides no real purpose to explore the future version of each level, because there's nothing in that particular time zone for you to track down. If anything, it acts as something of a punishment if you roll through the wrong sign and you don't slow down fast enough before the time travel kicks in, and sends your TARDIS colored hedgehog into the future, adding yet another layer of finding a sign, finding a space to pick up speed, going back in time, where you get to the present, where you have to find a sign, find some space to pick up speed, go back in time all over again, all while eating up precious time you could be using to hunt down a generator. I'm pretty okay with this setup. If you don't take care and watch your speed while you have a future sign, the game launches you forward in time and shows you what will happen to this world if you don't track down that generator. It's always dark and dreary. These bad futures aren't designed to be pleasant. Unlike Sonic 1 and 2, it shows there are actual repercussions to this world if Sonic doesn't do any of the secondary objectives. And really, as much time as you spend hunting down these generators, I feel like adding another objective in the future would just be tedious. I'm just fine not having any extra crap to do in the future. I feel like these particular complaints probably come from fans who have played this game to death, know where everything is already, and would just like something else to do. For me, even though I've beaten Sonic City more than a handful of times over the years, I still have a hard time keeping track of every single robot generator. By the time I've found everything, I'm more than ready to be done with that level. Like Sonic 1, these zones can overstay their welcome. I really don't mind not having even more to do in the future versions of each stage, and I feel the developers did a fairly decent job giving the future versions some meaning in this setup, not only acting as a punishment and therefore adding a layer of challenge, but also how it's implemented into the third act of every zone. And yes, I'm still going to call them zones and acts, deal with it. The third act is interesting for a couple of reasons. Like I said up front, the developers of Sonic CD and Sonic 2 tackled issues with the first game in very different ways, one of which was the time you would spend in each zone. Sonic 1 had 3 acts, and they would overstay their welcome sometimes. Giving you 3 different levels with the same theme and layouts can get a bit tedious. Sonic 2 sorted this out by simply chopping out that third act, leaving only 2 acts for each zone. Sonic CD would tackle this issue in an entirely different fashion. Like Sonic 1, each zone is split up into 3 acts, but unlike the first game, where the third act is a whole other level on its own, in CD, it's basically a boss room. You have very little platforming and almost no challenge to cope with before your showdown with Robotnik. I actually love this. It gives a sense of drama to the fight. Sonic 2's boss fights were just at the end of the second act, and it felt like you just accidentally ran into this doofus while he's out running errands. Sonic CD's third acts were usually built around the battle, and the little bit of land leading up to the fight just builds up tension. Giving the third act the singular purpose of serving the boss battle was a fantastic solution to the tedium, but they also serve a secondary purpose. The third act of each zone always takes place in the future version of that zone, and because of this, the environments act as something of a scorecard. If you zip through the level without bothering with any of the secondary objectives, you'd get a bleak, bad future. This imposing atmosphere would add to the tension of the upcoming battle, and even if you wreck Robotnik's current ride, it never really feels like you truly won. The damage was already done. Stopping Robotnik now wouldn't change what he's already done. But if you manage to bust both generators in the 2 previous acts, the future would be this bright, cheerful fusion of nature and technology. Animals would be dancing around, almost as if they're cheering you on. Even if Robotnik's here, they ain't leaving. If they're not scared, why should you be? He's just one last piece of trash to clean up before you carry on to the next area. Of course, if you wanted a more traditional Sonic experience, and you wanted a good ending without dealing with all this time travel nonsense, you could still play this game exactly like Sonic 1, and just collect 50 rings, jump into a giant warp ring at the end of the act, and play through bonus stages to collect Chaos Time Stones. More pointless renaming of crap. Like most Sonic games, the bonus stage is radically different from the others. In CD's case, they took advantage of the tricks that the Genesis could never do, and basically ripped off Super Nintendo's Mode 7. The objective here is to break break all the UFOs within a time limit, be mindful of speed boosters and fans, and win the day. I like these stages, but I also like old clunky attempts at 3D environments in games. The biggest problem I had was the depth perception in the original version of the game. Since the UFOs in Sonic are two-dimensional sprites on a 3D plane, it can be a little tricky to land a hit, but maybe that was just me. I still enjoy them all the same. And that's about it when it comes to gameplay, but there is one last major point of contention between fans when it comes to this game: the music. Yes, even in the soundtrack, we find yet another needless complication. For whatever reason, Sonic CD's American release got its own soundtrack, leaving the original one for Japanese and European audiences. The only real point of contention fans have is, which one sounds better? Oh yeah, and how the music of the past versions of each stage remains completely unchanged in the American version, so I guess it's kinda jarring and some people don't like that. There's not much else to say there, it just comes down to personal taste. I think generally, most Sonic fans lean in favor of the Japanese soundtrack, but I don't know, I think they're both pretty good. Actually, let's hang on this point for just a minute. I'm kinda glad this game came out with two unique sets of music. It shows how important a soundtrack can be for a video game. Playing with one version sets a completely different tone from the other. The Japanese original has a lot more rhythm, melodies infused with 90s record scratches and voice samples, and it makes you want to move, as any good Sonic soundtrack should. The American soundtrack, on the other hand, does its best to match the music with its surroundings. It really downplays a lot of the energy to give you some more ambiance. It's incredible how the music changes how a level can feel. I'll show you what I mean, take a listen. This is the Japanese version of Collision Chaos. Makes you feel like you're walking into a 90s dance club. But then you try the American version, and it's this tense, dreary piece, and suddenly everything feels more imposing, all because of the music. And if you're curious as to which one I prefer, well, I grew up with the American version, so I have a bit of a bias towards that soundtrack. Like the levels themselves, the Japanese music is soaking in 90s design, which you could argue makes it a better match. But while it is full of heart-pounding energy, I sometimes find it to be a bit much, especially during the slog of that last level. I'm trying to navigate a maze of scrap metal, just calm down. I generally prefer the American tracks because I spend a lot of time in these levels just exploring. The music tends to be less distracting and doesn't give me a sense of urgency when I'm trying to track down generators, but it really comes down to what I'm in the mood for at the time, and sometimes my preferences just change from level to level. That said, some of the American tracks have just stuck with me so hard as a child and will always blow their Japanese counterparts right out of the water. Don't get me wrong, I do enjoy some Japanese stuff, and honestly I much prefer the Japanese main theme over America's Sonic Boom, even if it has a ridiculous name. Toot Toot Sonic Warrior. That's the name. That's what it's called. I have no jokes. What more could I add? Look at that stupid mess of words. Someone was paid to sing those words. Wasn't it worth listening to all this talk about music just so we could get to this point? Toot Toot Sonic Warrior. Toot Toot indeed. But yeah, like I said, outside of that track, some American versions of the music are simply better, for me at any rate. The special stage music in the Japanese edition is just a mess of noise. I prefer the otherworldly nature of the American one. And I'm sorry, the boss fight music for the American version is just better. It's mechanical, creepy, and imposing. And in Japan,
earth-training, fear, bold, brain, cold heart, distance,
It's everything wrong with 90s music all in one track. And while I have grown to appreciate the Japanese version of the Bad Future of Stardust Speedway, for me, there is simply no topping the desperate, dark melody of the American version when it comes time to run that iconic race against Metal Sonic. We might as well talk about this guy. This is Metal Sonic, or Mecha Sonic as I knew him back in the day thanks to a certain comic book, or if you are a UK fan, Metallics. Look, whatever you want to call this thing, it's basically a robotic doppelganger of Sonic, and a new antagonist for this series. Now, robot doubles and evil twins are nothing new in fiction, and Sonic already had more than a couple robo-clones by this point. But unlike those generic piles of scrap, Kazuyuki Hoshino, a character designer who worked on the game, would create something that would not only rival Sonic in speed, but also in style. Like I've said previously in my other Sonic video and even in this one, I feel Sonic's design was a brilliant mix of contemporary coolness and timeless charm. Hoshino's Metal Sonic seemed to take on the same design philosophy. Instead of being a pile of metal plates formed together in the shape of Sonic, Metal Sonic would take the simple, standout features of Sonic's design and form something with its own identity. It's blue, but now with a chrome finish. Really, the entire color scheme is just as simple as Sonic's. Just replace the white and the skin pigmentation with silver and hints of yellow. Metal even has his own Cyclops eye, but it inverts the white and adds sinister glowing red pupils. Instead of Sonic's bare belly, Metal has an empty hole for air intake for that jet engine that he uses as his source of speed. He has skinny arms and legs with exaggerated hands and feet like Sonic, but instead of being all fun and noodly, Metal has rigid joints of thin, cold metal, almost giving it a skeletal look. Even Sonic's iconic spikes are repurposed into Metal's own iconic crescent-shaped quills. And while he does have speed, he doesn't run. Thanks to that aforementioned jet engine, he eerily hovers or blasts through the air. All this brings together something that looks like Sonic, but is very clearly not Sonic. It's not just a robot, it's something supernatural, something sinister. It looks like a skeletal ghost of Sonic. It keeps that simple but easily identifiable look of the hedgehog, but instead of attitude, we get something that looks cold and dangerous. He doesn't have an iconic smirk, not even an evil grin like this stupid schmuck right here. It's an emotionless killing machine. Who knew a robotic hedgehog could look so intimidating? But Metal isn't memorable in design alone. The role he plays in this game cemented him as one of the greatest Sonic villains of all time for many of us fans back in the day. Outside of the holograms and the quick cutscene in the second stage where he nabs Amy, who we'll get to in a moment, you really don't see this guy for most of your adventure. Honestly, the only actual interaction with him takes place on the second to last level and is over in just a couple of minutes. But man, what a couple of minutes they are. These brief glimpses at this cool and creepy robot just builds the anticipation for the inevitable showdown. Metal Sonic's on the cover of the game, regardless of the region you played it in. This guy was clearly meant to be a big deal. No way all of this buildup was for another run-of-the-mill boss fight where you hop on something a few times till it blows up. The boss fights in Sonic CD, like everything else in this game, are unlike any other battles in the classic Sonic series, for the most part anyway. That clever treadmill challenge, Collision Chaos's pinball battle that put Sonic 2's Casino Night boss to shame, and of course, the infamous showdown with Metal Sonic. Instead of having an actual fight with Metal Sonic, you raced him through a hazardous final act of Stardust Speedway. You have to navigate this level while avoiding spikes, as well as Metal Sonic's electric shield and speed boost. A simple concept that fits perfectly with the entire philosophy of the franchise. Now, I've got to be honest with you guys, I'm not one of these fans that considers CD the best of the series. I don't even think it's in my top 5. That said, the race against Metal Sonic is hands down my favorite boss encounter for this entire series. Yes, even compared to the grandiose final battles in other titles, future boss races, or even rematches with Metal Sonic. to me, nothing tops this original encounter. I just find it kind of ironic that Sonic 2 built the entire game around emphasizing Sonic's speed, but gave you a static, run-of-the-mill battle with a giant, clunky robot double. But here in Sonic CD, the game that slows down Sonic more than any other classic Sonic games, and it gives you a robot double that actually challenges Sonic's speed. And as common as these robo-clones tend to be in the series, it's a shame we really only see this race concept used here. It's also a shame that the next and final boss encounter is so pathetic in comparison. The boss fights in this game are all over the place, bringing in some of the weakest and some of the best of the classic series all within the same game. Everything feels like it's building up to the showdown with Metal Sonic, and everything after that is just cleanup. All this attention to Metal Sonic seems to have left little else for the other new character, Amy Rose. Just as Sega seemed to take a great deal of inspiration from Mickey Mouse when designing Sonic, they also seem to take a great deal from Minnie Mouse when designing Amy, namely by taking the same character design but slapping on a dress. Nothing really stands out about this character. I mean, they don't even get her name right in the American manual, and she's really only here for you to save her. I'm not really sure why she's here at all. I thought the whole saving the planet from the bad future while driving home an environmental message was good enough on its own. A message that's pervasive in all the classic games, but in other titles, the zones start off in a more colorful, inviting regions of nature, but eventually lead you to more mechanical environments as the game progresses, upping the challenge while making things feel more hostile as life and the natural world faded from the zones. In Sonic CD, they still kind of carry that subtle storytelling, but it's not exactly consistent from zone to zone, especially with that messy design I mentioned earlier. But they still use the environmental message all the same. They just built it into the time travel mechanic, giving the player a much more active role in saving the natural environment. Wait, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, Amy, I completely forgot. Honestly, I even forgot she was even kidnapped until you save her at the end of the race with Metal. Oh well, at least they flesh her out a little bit more in future games, so we'll get back to her when the time comes. Even though I spent a great deal more time talking about Metal Sonic, that's really all I got for Amy. Sonic CD seems to be full of these highs and lows, as you might have noticed with my flip-flopping through this entire episode. And considering how long we've spent talking about this game, without ever really breaking down levels like I've done with the past 2 Sonic episodes, yeah, you can see how this title is a bit divisive. Sonic CD is weird. It's unique. It's full of that experimental charm that's pervasive through this entire franchise. You can see the developers had fun in the weird little Easter egg pictures. Or they're working some things out. I'd even mention these awesome cutscenes from Toei, which really stood out back in the day. From the cutscenes, the music, the level designs, the time traveling, the boss fights, those weird little Easter eggs, Sonic CD was unlike any other classic Sonic game. And really, still is unlike any Sonic game, period. Even Sonic 4 Episode 2, which they touted as the direct sequel, plays nothing like CD. Yeah, you do get to fight Metal a couple more times, but it's not like they revisited the time travel mechanic or anything. But we'll deal with that game in its own episode. I know I bounced around a lot in this episode, and I try to sprinkle in my own personal opinion as much as possible. Still, it might be hard to read how I actually feel about this game. So to wrap things up, I'll just tell you that I don't think this game is perfect or even the best of the classic series. But despite the messy aesthetic and sometimes confusing level layout, I don't think this is a game to skip. It shows that even the classic Sonic formula, which is just run to the end of the level alive, maybe collect some emeralds if you feel like it, even this simple design can be used in wonderfully unique ways. It might not be my favorite, but I love that it exists. I love that I have a classic Sonic game that asks me to tackle these mechanics in wildly different ways. Go in with an open mind, a desire to explore, and a little bit of patience, and it's going to be a grand old time. And with that, we come to the end of another episode. I've been Nick, and I'm sorry for wasting your time. Toot toot, Sonic Warriors. Toot toot.
Oh, what a gentleman.